So we are at a small lime kiln site just outside the quay, and we're going to have a bit of a think about some of the economic geology that went on to support the enormous Stackpole Estate that lies just inland here. We'll think a bit more about that estate when we discuss the family who lived there for several centuries, the Campbells of Cawdor. So in the early 1700s, the Earl of Cawdor at the time, who was managing his big inland estate, built the quay here at Stackpole. And the quay served three purposes. It allowed luxury goods to come in to serve the estate, but there was also a limestone quarry. That quarry was doing an amazing economic geology job because it was providing three different products out of one tiny quarry in the early 18th century. Big blocks of limestone would be removed with crowbars, put on ships and removed for building materials. Smaller pieces though would be crushed and they would make their way into this lime kiln. So one of the beauties of economic geology in South Wales is that people who were extracting materials from the land also had access to coal. So high quality anthracite coal from the South Wales coalfield would be shipped in and combined with the limestone coming out of the quay. Both would be heated to 1,000 degrees Celsius in the lime kiln, and it would take about 24 hours for the calcium carbonate to become calcium oxide. That's a really important product because you can make a limestone mortar from it that was then exported as cement. But there was one extra product. Slaked lime could also be produced to spread on the agricultural lands, and that was really important because the Campbells were determined to produce really high quality agricultural lands on their estate, and adding the slaked lime to the fields massively increased the productivity on the estate. So one of the reasons the slaked lime was such an important product was the soils on this land that was continuously being looked at to improve productivity was really acidic. So by adding that calcium carbonate, the Campbells were able to neutralise that land to be able to grow more on it. So what we see here is a picture of a serious industrial landscape, from the agriculture, from the land drainage, from the tree planting, the quarry in the quay, and then the lime kiln. And there's actually been production here for thousands of years. But the Campbells saw a real opportunity here, and they turned this area, this remote little corner of Pembrokeshire, into a really productive working agricultural and industrial landscape. So for this little chapter of the film, we've come up to the Stackpole Estate itself, which is now owned by the National Trust, but there's actually been people here and recordings of buildings and communities for most of the last 1,000 years. So the first Stackpole family that the history books tell us about are the Lorts, who put an estate here in the 17th century. But this was around about the time where the English civil wars were raging. There were a few different campaigns actually within the civil wars. And the Lorts took the losing side. They were royalists and they supported the side of King Charles. And there's evidence that the estate was besieged in one of those wars, with the Earl having to hide in one of the caves in Barafundle Bay, and eventually they lost their estate. One of the things about the Stackpole Estate is that the women were really important here. They're really important in terms of the history, in terms of the huge landscape changes that went on here, and really in terms of the running of the entire estate. One of the first that we learn about was an heiress, Elizabeth Lort, who married into Scottish royalty, marrying Alexander Campbell in the late 17th century. And that was the start of an incredible period in history where the Campbells of Cawdor, who essentially were a royal Highland family, moved their entire family onto the Stackpole Estate, and they ran this place, ran this estate, grew it, built it for 260 years. So they occupied the Stackpole Estate and they were part of this community from really the mid-17th century until the Second World War. The Campbells Campbells had serious ambitions. Part of their reason for coming down and settling in West Wales was that they were very active in politics. Over the generations of the different Earls of Cawdor who were resident here, many of them were MPs, including one who ran for election both in his seat in Scotland and in Pembroke and was elected, so was an MP both in Scotland and in Wales at the same time. The remains of the landscape that we see in Stackpole now is mostly the work of one of the Earls, John Campbell, from the 1770s. And it was him who absolutely transformed the valley, creating the bridges, creating the lily ponds, and creating actually this very constructed, regal Victorian landscape just on the edge of Broadhaven and Barafundle and Stackpole Quay itself. And if you think about that close proximity and that juxtaposition of this manicured Victorian landscape with the wild wilderness of the Pembrokeshire coast, it's very obvious that a lot of landscape management has gone on here. So that landscaping and that changing of the natural landscape is actually really controversial. If you're an agriculturalist, what the Campbells did was create a productive landscape that became a really important part of Welsh farming. If you are an ecologist, what you're looking at is a situation where the natural wet meadows that should have been here with their really important biodiversity and ecology have been completely removed to put lily ponds with swans in that don't belong in this landscape. There's no right or wrong to this. It's just a really interesting reflection on how people have adapted this landscape for agriculture and industry. So the Stackpole Estate's journey gets really complicated and actually quite sad in the Second World War. And to understand how the estate ended, really, we need to introduce Jack, who was the 5th Earl of Cawdor, and he was born in the 1900s. And Jack was a bit of a wanderer. He was very outdoorsy, he was a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, he was a botanist. He travelled to the Himalayas in search of rare species and brought them back to the estate here. Things didn't work out for Jack. He had a very unhappy marriage and he was involved in a severe car accident that left him with profound facial injuries and chronic pain. And in the 1930s, he had had enough and he retreated back to the Campbells' estate in Scotland. That was really bad timing for the estate here because it was the build-up to the Second World War. And the estate was requisitioned by the Ministry of Defence in 1938. As part of that requisition, huge areas of land were taken over and bought, compulsory purchased by the Ministry of Defence. The oral histories of those families tell quite a bleak tale. In some occasions, they were only given a matter of weeks to leave the farms that they had been tenants on for generations, and their land was removed. And that land has never been given back to those families. It's now part of the Ministry of Defence's Castlemartin range. But it's not a simple story. So through the Second World War, the estate house was used as a training camp, it was used as a hospital, and it was pretty much would have been swarming with soldiers and a full part of Britain's war effort. After the war ended and through the 50s, it became essentially an expensive mess. The house had been incredibly badly damaged in the war and death duties had been brought in, which meant the family had huge bills when one of the earls was lost and needed to sell land to raise that tax bill, that inheritance bill. Eventually, coming into the start of the 1960s, they were just not able to cover the costs of the house anymore. In 1963, they applied for planning permission to convert what was left of the house, perhaps into a hotel or into some kind of educational facility, but it was turned down. And the Earl at the time, after a 3-day auction that was one of the biggest auctions in the history of Wales that sold 1,500 lots, including priceless antiques, books and artwork, demolished the house in 1963. And some of the foundations were actually used to build up the emerging oil refinery in Milford Haven. So this huge, beautiful estate actually had a really sad ending. and the lands that were removed by the Ministry of Defence from Welsh farming communities are still really contested and really controversial. But as I said before, it's not a simple story. The Castlemartin Range is one of the most important training facilities the Ministry of Defence have. And in fact, pretty much every British soldier that was involved in the conflicts in Afghanistan in recent years trained on the Castlemartin Estate just near us. Going back into the war, it was really important because soldiers who needed to learn to use the tanks were able to shoot in 180 degrees to have that space out to sea to train in. So this area of land is not only one of the most important areas of limestone cliff in Europe, really, it's also vital for the Ministry of Defence and a really important part of Welsh landscape heritage. We are sitting in the middle of a landscape that is important to just about everybody who uses it. So as part of that requisition of lands, 53 different families lost their farm, and 3/4 of the Castlemartin parish was lost, with the population of that village going down from 430 to just a few hundred people remaining. And the impact of that on the community is still felt by the descendants of that time. It was a huge loss of land and a huge loss of heritage for those Welsh farmers. And the Campbells' journey here in Pembrokeshire on the Stackpole Estate comes to an end in 1967 when they transfer 1,900 acres of this landscape into the care of the National Trust, including 8 miles of coastline, sand dunes, forestry, the Stackpole Estate itself, and the beautiful lily ponds.